Thank you very much indeed. And let me say, first of all, my thanks to the Renner-Institut for organizing this remarkable occasion and my visit to Vienna. I read two reports yesterday from the news service Bloomberg, which give a certain flavor of what the word reform has come to mean in Europe today. Both of them related to Greece, which, as you've heard, with which, as you've heard, I had a very close association in the first half of this year. And they describe the measures that the Greek Parliament must now adopt as a condition of passing its first quarterly reviews that will now come 4 times a year, of what is referred to in the press as a rescue program, so as to begin what the article describes as the long march to recovery. It's the tone of the piece. It goes on to describe that there are 48 measures to be enacted in the Greek Parliament in the next 10 days. They are available in Brussels. It is not clear whether they are fully yet available in Athens or whether they have been translated into Greek. The article mentions only 2 explicitly, actually either article, and they are laws on household insolvency, which means, so far as I know, bankruptcy and foreclosures, and on pension reform, which means cuts in Greek pensions. The question I wish to ask to begin with is, in what sense are these measures reforms? In what sense do they promote the well-being of the population or the recovery and growth of the Greek economy? I'm going to try to answer that question right now, but I will come back to it presently. This morning I read an interview with an economist whose work I know and respect, a man by the name of Michael Hudson, who has spent a lot of time recently in Latvia. He's the author of a new book called Killing the Host, and he describes conditions in Latvia, a country that emerged from the USSR with no debt and no mortgages on its housing stock. In the years since, the banks, mostly Scandinavian, moved in, gave loans against property values which were ever inflated, revised up to justify ever larger loans. And when it became clear that the loans could not be paid, the response of the regulatory authorities, who viewed the banks and not the population as their clients, was to extend the responsibility for the loans to the family members of those who had taken them out, so that you had joint responsibility for these mortgages. And the consequences of this process of reform is that, to an increasing degree, ordinary Latvians are priced out of living in their own country or foreclosed out of the homes that they have taken out mortgages on, and they have to emigrate in order to live. So I asked the same question. In what meaningful sense is this a reform? How does it promote the well-being of the population or the growth and development of the economy? It is not just a matter for Europe, and in fact, I don't think it really originates in Europe. To a very considerable extent, this is an American practice. It's a process that in the United States is very far and well developed. The cycle of bubble and dispossession is very well established. In the upswing, loans are made to people who cannot pay. In the slump, they are foreclosed. The lenders, in the US case in the years after 2001, the mortgage origination companies like Countrywide and AmeriQuest, banks like Oamu and others collapse. Their officers mostly escape, enriched by the vast fees that they've earned on the origination and then on the securitization of the mortgages. A small amount of inquiry reveals that the underlying documentation was largely fraudulent. The prosecutors pass over that fraud to the largest extent. To the extent they go after anybody, it's often after the people who took out the loans rather than the people who extended them. Only a few reporters remain on the beat as hundreds of thousands or millions of people are foreclosed and dispossessed and end up having to abandon their homes. The reform that underlay this process in this case was something that happened several decades ago, something that I experienced actually as a young professional working on the staff of the Banking Committee, the House of Representatives, financial deregulation, and then the withdrawal of supervisory responsibility for the functioning of the financial system. The consequences include a landscape of urban devastation, which is not unrelated to the cycle of social violence that one observes rising in the United States at the present time. It's not coincidental that, for example, the city of Baltimore, which has been afflicted by this violence, is a major center of the foreclosures that followed the subprime boom and bust. The city of Cleveland is another example. These are places which may not ever recover from this type of reform. In early June, on the 8th of June this year, I had an interesting experience of traveling up from Athens to Berlin with the finance minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis. He was giving a speech in Berlin, and incidentally, we had a small meeting, basically a private meeting with the German finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble. Very interesting and candid professional meeting. On the way back, we fell to a discussion about this question of reform, which has remained with me. Yanis remarked that the word, in the meaning that it currently holds amongst economic policymakers in Europe, had its origins actually in probably the middle 1960s or maybe earlier in the Soviet Union. What it meant at that time and in that country was a process of introduction of market mechanisms and also decentralization. I would take it that in Europe and also in the United States today, where the word has slightly different origins, it also comes from the tradition of repetitive, mostly regressive tax reform, but it still means market processes. But that the element that animated the reform economists of the Soviet Union, which is to try and achieve decentralization and diversity in an overly rigid system, has largely faded out, disappeared from the meaning of the term. What reform meant to Greece, what reform has meant, as far as I understand it, in Latvia, has been the imposition of a single model of economic process, something which actually has a very centralized origin and from which very little deviation is to be permitted. It would be a bit sharp, but not entirely unreasonable to refer to it as market Stalinism. What the Greek government sought to achieve in its relationships with the European partners in this period was truly quite simple and based upon a clear and well-argued understanding that what had transpired in Greece in the 5 years since the original memorandum was adopted had been a failure of performance, a failure of the reaction of the Greek economy to that memorandum on very specific points. That is to say that the deregulation of the labor market, which basically eliminated what collective bargaining existed in Greece, as well as reducing the minimum wage, had not produced employment. It had produced a reduction of wages and a rise in profit margins, but also a increasing informalization of the labor market, which undermined the tax base of the pension system and more generally of the state. The pension cuts did not revive the sustainability, which were on the order of 44 to 49%, did not revive the sustainability of the Greek pension system, but simply deepened the effective impoverishment of a certain segment of the elderly population and reduced the overall effective demand in the economy, reducing the capacity of the Greek economy to sustain itself. Campaigns of privatization, which were intended to raise substantial sums of revenue for the state, raised very little on the very simple proposition that when you put everything on the auction block at once, the price falls. Your buyers, knowing that you are under pressure to sell, do not offer you a very attractive deal. Internal devaluation, which was the watchword for restoring competitiveness, simply deepened the effective indebtedness of the Greek private sector. What was imposed and continues to be imposed on Greece and in other similar contexts is therefore effectively a policy of debt collection dressed up in this marvelous word, reform. It's a policy of dispossession both of the public and the private sector. There is a rhetorical and ostensible purpose of this policy, and that is, of course, to promote economic growth. And the question that then must be raised is there even a conceptual link between the policies, as I've described them, and the objective, as it is so frequently stated? I had the rather doubtful privilege about a week ago of being in Dallas, Texas, for a conference at an university, Southern Methodist University, which happens to be the site of the George W. Bush Library, at which I shared a program with the former senator from Texas, my fellow economist, Phil Gramm, a man whom I once described to the Washington Post as the sorcerer's apprentice of financial instability and disaster. The Post called him up and read that to him, and he said, "I deny it," which I always thought was really quite wonderful. And the luncheon speaker on this occasion, this was not, as you imagine, a meeting of my fellow progressives, was Mr. George Will, a noted columnist for the Washington Post over many years, a very articulate and erudite man of extraordinarily predictable views, who helped me out by articulating in, I thought, extremely clear terms the apparent philosophical mechanism that links this type of so-called reform to the problem of growth. And it was very simple, really. From this point of view, the problem of the welfare state, the problem of the existing structure of pensions, of unemployment insurance, of nutrition assistance, food stamps, of health insurance, of whatever it is that the state provides for its population, is simply that it promotes dependency and sloth. And this then produces a culture of aversion to work, which can only be changed in this line of argument by breaking apart and demolishing the welfare state. Let's say systematically, it was good to be in a group of true believing conservatives because they speak to each other with a clarity that you often don't hear if you were simply observing from the outside. This applies even, by the way, to such things as disability insurance, where it is presumed that large numbers of people on disability must mean that they are faking their medical conditions. Proposition for which there's no actual evidence, although it may well be true in some cases. Reform, therefore, is to cut the benefits and raise the retirement age, which is a way of, in particular in the United States, and I think in other contexts, of cutting the benefits for those people who feel obliged to retire when they're relatively young because they've been living and working in particularly hard jobs. And this spur to work effort, it is proposed, will raise the growth rate of the economy. And it is the higher growth rate of the economy which is then held forth as the solution to all other social problems. That is to say, a way in which to increase the material well-being of the population as a whole. It is, particularly if you have some experience, as I have, of living in the American South, a recognizable model. It's the model of the plantation. Pure and simple. A model in which work will appear by magic, given enough foremen and enough whips. As economics, of course, it's an exercise of the purest imagination. There is, on the other side of this argument, a certain kind of latter-day Keynesianism, which I have to say I also do not share, which holds that the problem is strictly a matter of inadequate effective demand, and that if you simply provided the spending population with more money, that the problem of growth would be resolved by people going into the stores and demanding more goods. I differ from that and share with the conservative perspective, actually, the thought that there is something more involved, that there must be, and probably is at this stage in the development of our societies, an aspect of the growth problem which is structural. I suspect that's a position which has considerably more sympathy, actually, in the European audience than it does in an American one. And in my book, The End of Normal, which was mentioned earlier, I describe what I think are four principal sources of structural difficulty that we face today that my generation 30, 40 years ago did not apparently face. First has to do with resources. I grew up in a world where the resource constraint, certainly as seen from North America, was relatively minor. It was something that we talked about in the 1970s, and it receded again in the US as it did not in Europe in the 1980s. But at the turn of the millennium, it appeared again, and in a particular form, of speculative and financialized energy markets, which have the property that as apparent shortages appear, or at least as excess demand appear, prices go up very rapidly. And they rose to $148 per barrel of oil in the period just before the crisis. And then they have a tendency to collapse as inventories are unloaded. So a speculative process turns out to generate unstable cycle. I call it the choke chain effect, or what happens when you have a choke chain on your dog and it moves very fast, you jerk him back. Which has a bad effect both on the production and the consumption side. It discourages, the low prices tend to cut back and cause instability in the markets for substitutes and renewables, and the high prices tend to cause problems in the demand for underlying goods. The second area, which is not entirely unrelated, has to do with the fact that a half-century of stability in the larger world economy, or the larger world political system, that initially was the product of reasonably stable post-war, tense but stable post-war balance of power between the United States and its allies on the one side and the USSR on the other. That collapsed 20 years ago and was succeeded for only a short period by a vision of a world in which you could have a single super hegemon. I think it's pretty clear now that that illusion could be sustained only so long as it was not tested, and that as the governments of the United States had the temerity or the boldness to test the proposition over the last decade, that its limits became increasingly apparent. And we have the situation in Iraq, the situation in Afghanistan, now the situation in Syria, which make this extremely obvious, especially to the professional military, but even in some quarters of American political life, and obviously very much elsewhere in the world. And a world which does not have a stabilizing global political mechanism with the expectation that it will last for a long time is a world in which certain kinds of long-term investment are going to be affected. And certain times kinds of investment will shift from the longer to the shorter end of the spectrum as a result of that. So recognition, by the way, that the role of military power as the projection of imperial systems has become, in our days, fundamentally obsolete and unworkable. A third area, rather more mundane and perhaps closer to all of us, is the particular character of the technological period, call it a technological revolution, through which we have been passing now for the last 20 years. That is to say, the role of digital technology. It's perfectly clear, I think, to all of us that digital technologies have had an exceptional effect on the quality of certain aspects of our lives. They have certainly reduced the cost of communication, essentially to nothing at the margin, which is a remarkable development. I grew up in a world where the long-distance call from Europe to the United States cost $8 and $1960 a minute. But now, of course, you have too much communication. It's an entirely different situation. But that's not the aspect of this technology that seems to me to be the most pertinent here. Most pertinent aspect is that the technologies save labor. They massively reduce the labor force requirements of the office sector, the service sector, compared to what it was before. And that doesn't happen automatically or just because the technologies are introduced. What tends to happen is that in a slump, businesses lay off people. And in the recovery, they look around for ways not to hire them back, particularly if it turns out that the introduction of electronic machinery is tax advantaged and does not impose the fixed costs of health insurance and other, and training, for example, that would be required if you were bringing your labor force back as it was before. And economists tend to be quite blithe about this phenomenon. They say, well, only if we had more demand, we would have more jobs. And they point to previous technical revolutions in which the jobs created were at least as substantial or exceeded the jobs that were destroyed. That's true, for example, I think you can fairly say of the automotive revolution of a century ago. That displaced a great number of people who were previously engaged in the raising and care of horses. But it created ultimately a great many more jobs, not just in the production, but in the maintenance of automobiles, in the production and the maintenance of the surfaces over which they travel, and in the whole spectrum of accessory industries. I would just simply argue, first of all, that it's very unclear that the technological revolution through which we're passing now has the same characteristic. And it's the maintenance and the infrastructure are not nearly as labor demanding as was the case of that previous revolution. One little example, by the way, is that I'd like to cite these things, smartphones, which have a very interesting effect on freight transportation, air freight transportation between Asia and the United States, or Asia and Europe. Saves airplanes and pilots. Why? Because these things are small. You can pack a lot of them into a single cargo plane. And as a result, the material effect on the freight business of a company like Federal Express. It's not a bad thing from a social standpoint, but it's a phenomenon of generalized labor saving. Is there a parallel with that earlier revolution? Well, yes, there is. There was a sector of the workforce in the early 20th century that was never reemployed. That was the horses. They didn't come back. So that is something with which we have to deal, and presumably we will not apply the same, let's say, approach that we applied to the equine population. And the fourth area is an institutional factor, an institutional and therefore partly a legal factor, which is the hypertrophy and dysfunction of the financial sector. Something which has become enormously clear in the United States, especially as we have moved to a world in which half a dozen very large banks dominate the financial scene, and it's very hard to determine what it is that's in the larger social interest that they actually do. Where the financial sector has basically abandoned its partnership with the state and the promotion of common social objectives, yet it retains a power of blackmail and of political control over state apparatus, which gives it a very large freedom of maneuver, both in international and domestic markets. And it strikes me that a financial sector of that type, which has not got a chartered sense of mission and has not decentralized, and which controls the state rather than being controlled or at least effectively regulated by it, is not likely to be a financial sector that meets the social requirements of the economic conditions that I've just described. Social requirements of providing jobs, social requirements of dealing with the challenges of an energy problematic economy, and the social requirements, which I haven't even begun to discuss, of dealing with climate change and environmental stress, which do not bear so heavily on the immediate economic situation, but obviously loom in front of us as colossal challenges. So if these are the problems, and I think that's a reasonable short list of them, then it strikes me that there are challenges. The capacity to overcome them, to mitigate them, is not zero, but it's also not unlimited. The energy issue, especially if it is combined with the environmental climate question, is a question that's going to be with us for a long time. 5 years ago, when I was beginning to develop these ideas and to lay them out in a coherent way, 6 years ago, the phenomenon of shale in the United States had barely gotten underway. It has since developed very greatly, but with an underlying question of how long it will last and what the precise physical properties of these deposits actually are. And those are questions that are, so far as I know, unresolved to this day, because the underlying physics has to be, and geology has to be worked out in real time. There's no clear way to model it ex ante. And those industries may already be suffering, are already suffering from the consequences of the energy instability that collapse in the price of oil. In any event, whatever happens on the energy front, the environmental question is certainly one that's going to bind ever more tightly as time goes on, and that poses a set of, let's say, unavoidable choices. We can burn up the planet in this generation, in which case the survivors 2 generations hence will not remember us kindly. Or we can do something different, in which case we do have to modify our behavior in ways that cannot be, let's say, in which you cannot rely on purely uncoordinated mechanisms. On the security question, of course, security issues can be resolved, but there are no guarantees, particularly in an increasingly unstable world. The proposition that one should avoid doing stupid things is probably a good idea. It would be useful for powerful states to take that advice. But the fact is that a security arrangement, once it has been disrupted, is not easily restored. The one that we got after the Second World War was stable in part because of the memory of the Second World War, and in part because of the arrival at that moment of the atomic bomb. Those stabilizing forces are no longer present in the modern world, so we can't be guaranteed that we're going to improve on that front. The digital revolution is irreversible. The technologies once created will continue to erode employment in successive sectors as they are extended to have capabilities that they didn't previously have. That's very clear, and everybody who many of us, of course, who experience this firsthand on a daily basis. That does not mean that we are doomed to be to high levels of unemployment, but it means that we must have imaginative solutions to the problem of designing the work environment for people who come after us, for the next generation. That we must think very carefully about what it is that we want people to be doing. Now, I like very much the idea of an employment system based upon public lectures, because you have one speaker and immobilize 230 people in the room. That's a very good use of time, actually. But my larger point is that that we can take advantage of, full advantage of, the improvement in living capabilities from the technical revolution only if we use our heads and our institution building capacities to make sure that people have houses in which they can enjoy these technologies and jobs to finance their consumption of them. If we don't do that, then the benefits of this will accrue only to a very small number of people who happen to be at the top of the production chain. As far as fixing his finances concerned, that is a problem for which, as a lifelong student of misbehaving banks, I do not have a readily available answer. I think it's very difficult. It's a problem at the nexus, if you like, of political power, financial power, and of technological change, which of course these institutions are deeply invested in, and which gives them capacities to evade and escape a large part of the regulatory pressures that one might otherwise bring to bear. I think that the problem of fundamental reform here, therefore, needs to be discussed very openly and in a very serious way. In the United States, I think it does mean breaking up the institutions so that they are smaller, and so that it is possible to have what my father used to call countervailing power between the public and the private sector in the management, in the direct management of financial institutions. Large, opaque institutions are that much more difficult to manage and control than smaller and more transparent and simpler ones. But this is not a simple or an easy problem, and there's so far been, at least in the American experience, no effective resolution of it, and I think my European friends who study the evolution of banking policy in Europe feel the same way about the policies in the European Union. So what does it mean overall? And we'll come to that and conclude. I think it means that we can reasonably expect that there's no simple return to the growth path to which my generation became accustomed in the post-war period. No simple return. And therefore, we ought to think about how to best organize our social relationships, our institutions, in an environment which is likely to be more difficult than the one our parents experienced or the ones that we experienced when we were younger. There is a line of thought that proceeds from this, which is, again, the conservative line of thought, which says that with the arrival of more difficult times, we cannot afford the luxury of welfare state, of the notion of a common good, of a systematic and comprehensive system of social insurance. I would draw the opposite conclusion, actually. And I would draw it from the historical experience, in particular of the United States in the Great Depression. To the extent that we have a welfare state, and it's actually substantially greater than I think it is portrayed as being in much of particularly the European press, Social Security, the minimum wage. That welfare state was created not in a time of prosperity, but in a time of deep depression. And it formed one of the fundamental foundations of the growth and recovery of the US economy in the post-war period. It was reinforced by a system of admittedly incomplete, but nevertheless substantial public health insurance in the 1960s, Medicare, Medicaid, which greatly relieved the burden of healthcare costs on the most vulnerable elderly part of the population as well as on the poor. And when you add to that the food stamps program and a whole unemployment insurance and a large number of other things, you discover that in the reaction to the crisis in the United States in 2008, 2009, the share of these expenditures, the share of the support to the income of ordinary Americans went up by a very substantial portion of GDP, about 9 percentage points, everything taken together. With the result that while Americans lost a great deal of their housing wealth and they lost a large part of their retirement security and their public services were hurt, and a great many bad things happened, and of course many people were foreclosed on their homes, the incomes that were lost were substantially mitigated or shielded or replaced. And the result of that was that the American economy as a whole, while not recovering to its previous growth track, was much more resilient than has proved to be the case in the crisis countries of Europe, where austerity has meant that the automatic stabilizing functions of these systems were effectively dismantled. That's a fundamental difference, and I think the lesson that it draws is that one should draw is that the principles and institutions which were so much part of the construction of this country in the post-war period remain, in fact, fundamental principles and institutions for moving forward in more difficult times. They are not luxuries to be dispensed with, but they are part of the foundation of adapting to difficulty. And there's a very simple basis for this. It's that when you have a lower overall rate of growth, you have to worry more about the variability. You have to worry more about the people who are at the lower end of performance income growth in that period, because they're more likely to suffer catastrophic losses. And if you protect them, if you help insure them against the worst of those losses, they will in turn be more secure, lead better lives, and also be more active participants in economic life, and therefore have a better chance of participating effectively in the general reconstruction and strengthening of the community. And so, what's the strategy here? It is certainly not to break apart the welfare state and to entrust everything to the pure and brutal functioning of an unfettered market. It's rather to think of ways institutionally and practically to expand the kind of employment that we need, employment that is low impact with respect to energy, but high impact with respect to social services and human needs, to strengthen the framework of social insurance so that people who are in vulnerable positions feel secure against the worst things that can happen to them, to work on the constraints as well as on the environmental challenge that we face, to put some resources there, major resources there, so as to make the management of those constraints easier than it would otherwise be, and to reduce the drain of predatory, resource-intensive intermediates, people, the military services, for example, the large financial institutions that are not providing final consumption goods and that were designed to be, let's say, effective rent gatherers in a less, in a more elastic and less constrained time. If we do those things, then it seems to me that we can navigate the problems that we face in a way which will be remembered favorably by our descendants, while at the same time permitting us and our children to live reasonably good and full, successful, and happy lives, which should be the test, after all, of whether an economic policy is a sensible one. Thanks very much.